guys! So in today's video, I'm again doing something a little different than what I usually do. I've been trying to push outside my comfort zone when it comes to videos, and I'm going to be reviewing the sketchbook I'm currently using. So this is what the sketchbook looks like. It's soft cover, and it has stitching down the side of it. This is actually a special edition, and the brand is Baron Fig, and I actually found this company a while back, and I purchased a lot of notebooks from them. They have lined and dot grid versions of their sketchbooks, and even though I've been using their notebooks for a while, I never actually ordered a blank page version of one of their notebooks. However, when this limited edition set came out, in which they had gradients of different colors, I couldn't help myself, and I decided to finally buy some blank paper sketchbooks. Now, something to note about these sketchbooks is I don't think they're actually advertised as sketchbooks. I think they're actually advertised as just blank page notebooks. However, for something that isn't actually a sketchbook, I personally really like it. That's a sticker of mine that I stuck on the cover there. That doesn't come with it. So a couple of details about the sketchbook itself. It comes in a pack of 3 different sketchbooks, and the entire set of 3 is $12. So that's $4 a sketchbook, and they have 72 pages in total. You can see some of the stats at the back here. And here it says it is a Vanguard flagship version of the sketchbook. And that is both the soft cover and the size. I believe Vanguard is the fact that it is a soft cover, and the flagship is the size of it. And this is very similar in size to a lot of sketchbooks that I typically use. It's about half a sheet of paper. I can measure it here. It is 5 3/8, I guess, by 7 5/8, it looks like. And yeah, so that's all of the specifics about the sketchbook itself. And I did a time lapse of a piece that I pretty much used every medium possible on, and I will be discussing some of the pros and cons of the sketchbook there. One of my main goals for this sketchbook page specifically was to use as many different types of materials as I could possibly think of. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that this is a sketchbook review, and I wanted to throw as much at the pages as I possibly could, so you as a viewer could get an accurate representation of what the paper acts like in response to different types of mediums. I also work very mixed media a lot of the time, and I throw a lot at my pages. So this is a very similar style to how I would use a sketchbook, though maybe not all of the mediums I used. However, starting with the very first thing I put onto this paper, which was watercolor, it does work, and I've used watercolors fairly frequently throughout the pages of this sketchbook. It definitely has a different texture than you may be used to seeing with watercolor, but personally I find that very enjoyable. I think it's very interesting to look at. It's just not watercolor paper. It also warps the paper a little bit. Personally, I don't mind. I think warped paper kind of adds character to sketchbooks, and one of my favorite feelings in the world is a finished sketchbook that's fluffy because it has so much in it and the pages have warped. So personally, I don't mind that. if you're looking for paper that doesn't warp with watercolor, this is not the sketchbook for you. I tried both a wet on dry and a wet on wet technique. The wet on dry is the top section, and the wet in wet is the bottom section. And both work. They definitely ran a little bit, and you can see me trying to fix that disaster in the time lapse, but it does work and creates some interesting textures. Now, moving into markers. I have used both water-based markers and alcohol-based markers in this sketchbook, even though in this piece in particular they were in limited quantities. The eyes were done with a water-based marker, and the alcohol marker was the lips, and the paper really takes them very well. Water-based, it takes several layers before it starts eating through the paper. I think primarily because the paper itself has a almost slick texture, and so the water-based markers almost react to that in a way that is not like a rougher textured paper. Of course, the alcohol markers do bleed through. It's pretty much impossible to find a sketchbook in which alcohol markers do not bleed through, unless it's specifically made for that purpose. So expect alcohol markers to bleed through, but you can use them. With my style in particular, I would say that pens are one of the most important things to use. They need to work. And I used all types of pens on this piece. I used brush pens, I used microns, and I used ballpoint pens, and they all work fine. With my last sketchbook, ballpoint pens did not work, and that was a real disappointment to me because one of my favorite things to do is just doodle with ballpoint pens. It takes a lot of the pressure off because they're not that expensive, and I like the finished effect. So the fact that they do work in this sketchbook is a plus. Now, looking a little into pencils, actual graphite pencils do work pretty well on this paper. They smudge fairly easily. I think, again, because of the texture of the paper, it's not really good for gripping things like that. And this really shows through with colored pencils. When you start using colored pencils, this paper isn't really the best for colored pencils. If you do primarily colored pencil work, I would recommend finding a different sketchbook. I have used colored pencils consistently through this sketchbook anyways, and if you're okay with not getting the darkest darks with a kind of mid-tone pencil, you will be able to use this sketchbook, I believe, for what you're looking for. And I find with colored pencils, the darker the color, the easier they show up. It's kind of hard to use white colored pencils on this paper, even if you've put down watercolor. It doesn't really work to add highlights like it did in my toned gray sketchbook. But if you do something like add acrylic, which I also did, you can layer the color on top of that. Now, speaking of acrylics, I don't use a lot of acrylics in my sketchbooks, but I have been kind of inching towards that a little bit in recent weeks. So I figured I would throw that in there as well. This girl's hair is painted with acrylics, and honestly, for such a thin paper, it's really good for acrylics. It doesn't really do anything. It doesn't warp even. It's only the watercolor that really causes it to warp. The acrylics, it stayed pretty sturdy with acrylics, which is an interesting thing to note. And another thing that this worked very well with is gouache. I've done several gouache paintings throughout this sketchbook, and again, it doesn't really warp the paper that much. The only thing that really warps the paper is if you add a lot of water. Again, I think this is to be expected from something that isn't necessarily watercolor paper, and it is a rather thin paper in general. But as far as gouache and acrylic are concerned, the paper takes them incredibly well for as cheap as the sketchbook is. And gel pens are actually the final thing that I wanted to discuss in this video. I tend to use white gel pens a lot to add highlights, and I know a lot of other artists do as well. And the paper takes it fine. You have to be careful not to smudge it because the paper is slick, and I think it does keep it a little wetter for a little longer, but once it's dry, it's fine. So all in all, I think that this is a very good sketchbook for mixed media as long as you don't mind a little bit of paper warping and you're willing to experiment a little bit with different textures when it comes to your watercolors. And same with colored pencils. If you're primarily a colored pencil artist or you're primarily a watercolor artist, it's probably not the best. But if you work a lot in inks, you work a lot in gouache or acrylic, or even markers, I think this is actually a very decent sketchbook for something that is incredibly cheap. And I definitely will be purchasing more of these sketchbooks in the future. So I hope this video was helpful and that you learned something new about the Baron Fig sketchbooks. If you have any ideas for videos that you would like to see from me, feel free to leave them in the comments. Thank you all for watching. You can subscribe if you want, and I will see you guys next time. Bye.